Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tri Mechanics podcast. This episode is all going to be about strength training for running. So, why is strength training for running so important? It's become, again, one of these topics that kind of goes around in circles, that we go through this phase of you should be doing lots of strength training, and then people bring up the argument of, well, there are a lot of elite athletes, particularly a lot of African athletes, that don't do any at all, which is generally seen now as false. Not only do they tend to do a lot of strength training, but their situation is slightly different in that actually we're going to be talking now what you're trying to achieve from strength training, and you could probably appreciate that actually they might not need to do it. So, why is strength training so important? Well, the key to essentially being able to run a faster marathon, or possibly half marathon, or even a kind of 5 and 10K, so the shorter races, is partly your ability, essentially your biomechanics, your ability to apply your fitness to the world, so to speak. But also in the longer races, it's partly your ability to hold yourself together. So this is one of the key things. I like people to work back and really think about how long, if they're doing a 3 to 4 hour marathon or even longer, they're spending a lot of time on their feet. And if you're spending a lot of time on your feet, you need to have the ability to essentially hold your body together. I mean, the epitome of this is towards the end or even during the middle of an Ironman marathon. You essentially are just fighting the urge to slow down. That's all it's about. You are enduring, you are trying not to stop. And part of that is that fight of slow down is trying to stop your body from falling apart. Now, the better you can hold yourself on one leg and then essentially hop onto the other leg, which is running, the better you're going to be able to hold yourself together. What you've really got to think about is that running isn't like walking. Walking is very different. When you feel very beaten up and you walk as opposed to run, suddenly everything feels okay again. And even running with a very short stride and very slow pace can feel quite tough. And the reason is because it's a very different process. When we're walking, we're essentially straightening our leg and pivoting and kind of unbalancing onto the next leg. Whereas running, we're asking a lot of muscles to do a lot of work to hold us upright as we land on one leg and keep all the body weight that's on the other side from potentially tipping us over. So the reason that becomes so important is because the strength and control, particularly around areas like the hip, are absolutely critical in continuing to hold us together. So just a quick set of notes before we really kick into things. So if you haven't got time to listen to the whole podcast, the general notes for today are strength training is extremely important, and it's more important the longer the race that you do. It can apply both in terms of short and long races, in terms of things like plyometrics and explosive movements, to essentially very controlled strength training and heavyweight lifting that can particularly more apply to the longer stuff. It's applicable to all runners, and it most definitely does not need to take place in a gym. That's the kind of overall notes, is that most things can be done with body weight or work at home to really get the most out of it. So, strength training. So I did a podcast with Brad Kearns from Primal Endurance that will be coming out relatively soon the other night, talking about, we got onto this subject of kind of movement and how we need to move better and how we can try and cultivate those movements better in daily life. And part of that is doing what you would call strength training, but around the home. So doing things like squats, like a bodyweight squat counts as strength training. Essentially, you are going to a more extreme end of your range of motion, and you're requiring your muscles to do a little bit more work to keep you balanced and stable. And that is essentially what strength training really is. What it's trying to do when it comes to running is increase your capacity. So increase that movement capacity, your movement window as such, in that if you gain more strength and control, you can move your limbs greater through that kind of window around your centre of gravity without causing any issues. Now, if you imagine that you're relatively, let's call it strong and weak, because those are the terms that are often thrown around, even though I don't think they really apply in that way. Let's say you're relatively weak around your hips. Your brain isn't going to allow you to move your limbs outside of that centre of gravity for fear that you might fall over. So it'll keep everything kind of locked in. And that can also, this can sometimes cause a lot of injuries, in that actually, if we're particularly weak in certain muscle groups, and yet we still enable that movement, that range of motion, then other muscles can often bear a bit more brunt and they can cause a lot of problems. But also sometimes it's all those niggly aches, those tightness that you feel that makes you feel like you want to stretch, is often a lack of strength and control, which means that that muscle has been tightened down by the brain to stop you moving into that position. So think of it from that perspective. Think of it the fact that when you're doing strength training, you're trying to increase your general range of mobility through strength and control. That's the key thing. So yoga is a perfect example. Yoga is strength training. It is not stretching, as we've discussed before. It is taking your limbs outside of their normal preferred range of motion, or extending that range of motion by basically learning how to control the muscles better, and that increases their strength. Now, when it comes to, say, lifting weights and increasing muscle strength, we don't need a lot. So actually, we've got to work back from what we're trying to achieve. So what we're trying to achieve as a runner is muscle activation more than anything else, getting all the right muscles switched on and all coming to the party. Now, that can be achieved through very little weight, and actually a lot of it can be achieved through body weight. And you should actually try and master body weight movements first before you go on to the weight side of things. Weights are often cheating. By adding that extra weight, you negate the need to slow the movement down and control it. So if you think of strength training to start off with, something like Tai Chi, essentially a very slow, controlled movement, doing things like standing on one leg, but then moving the other leg around outside of your center of gravity as much as you can. That, in essence, is the start off of controlled strength training. The slower you can move it, and I have this argument with clients all the time, when you get better at a movement, you move it slower. That is aiming on that control. But I tend to like to polarize this in that sometimes you move really, really slowly. And then sometimes you move very, very fast. So doing things like plyometrics. Now that's completely different. That's when you're working on the explosive contraction and elasticity and recoil. And doing things like hopping and those things, very fast movements, will enhance the ability to use that elastic recoil. And this is essentially summed up both for the kind of neuromuscular control side of things, but also the exact same protocol seems to work for tendons and cartilage and tissue repair. Keith Barr's studies on collagen, tendons, and basically how to use gelatin, a very small dose, about 10 grams, before you do these kind of, about an hour before you do any kind of skipping or running. So you can use your gelatin that you would find at the supermarket, but that's not ideal because it's got some horrible additives in it. But getting some gelatin off Amazon is a great option. The Go Nutrition one is the one that I use, that's about £5 for 250 grams and contains no additives, but also using things like glycine as well. But using that about an hour before. So he showed, but using that an hour before with a touch of vitamin C, you would increase the collagen uptake, essentially, or the collagen repair within tendons and within that connective tissue. And his protocols for then working on that connective tissue were a combination of either skipping, hopping, fast movements, plyometrics, or very, very slow heavyweight movements that increased what he called shear forces and cross-linking. So the explosive hopping and those side of things work on essentially that laying down or the stimulus basically in that collagen. So what they're trying to do, they don't help the repair, they create the damage that then creates a stimulus for you to then repair that tendon and those soft tissues. Doing the slow weightlifting increased the shear forces between the collagen fibers, which increased their cross-linking, meaning they became stronger and stiffer. And that's the critical thing, is that there was more cross-linking, so the tendon became stiffer, enabled you to basically provide more elastic recoil. So they actually found that there was increases in performance and those side of things. Also, the other thing is where you move things slower and in a non-compensated way. So, for instance, standing on one leg but without that leg right in the centre, you actually then work on the complexes or the supporting muscles, and that's the critical thing. You often see, the great example of this is you see people go and try and bench press, and they've never bench pressed before, and they can lift very little weight. Well, that's not because of a failure of the pec muscles, the prime movers, of pushing up that bar. It's often a failure of the supporting muscles. But within a week or two, often they can then lift that bar quite comfortably. Not because the muscles have got stronger, but because they've learned to coordinate themselves together, use those stabilizers. And that's why people can cheat by using something like a Smith machine, which is a supported and an assisted bench press, they can lift a lot more weight, because what those machines do, rightly or wrongly, is take away the need for the stabilization muscles and then put essentially the pressure onto the prime movers. The problem with running is that you don't have that support. As you come into land, you require all those stabilizers. They are the ones that are doing so much of the work to keep you together. So what kind of strength training can we do? What kind of things can we do at home? So doing bodyweight squats is a fantastic way. Doing things like spending time in a crouch position with your heels off the ground. I've talked about this before. You kind of crouch down as if you're reading a book, as if you're sitting around a campfire. Sitting there for 5-10 minutes really works on the strength of the feet and the calves. Doing things like walking upstairs, 2 or 3 stairs at a time, helps work on hip extension. You can even do that with a weight. So you could even get yourself a kettlebell or something similar, because those are fantastic tools to have at home. And then each time you walk up and down the stairs, you carry the kettlebell with you. This is fantastic. Or you could just put a bag with some anything heavy, a few baked bean tins or something, and then just do the same thing with that. Instead of having to go to the gym and using a weight to step up at the gym, you could just use your own stairs. You could do things like what I call Spider-Man hoovering, which is where you take a kind of cordless, short, small hoover, and instead of using your kind of one on a telescopic thing, you then just use it on a short, stubby, kind of stubby end. That means that you have to then get around onto the floor and move around, work on hip mobility, but also work on strength and control. The other fantastic tool I mentioned is a kettlebell. I like to do what I call get to be able to do is a snatch, a special kind of snatch, which is I call it the night fever snatch. So if you imagine the night fever dance, you're essentially doing a kettlebell snatch just like that. So you put the kettlebell, a relatively small weight, near, let's say, just in front of your left foot. You squat down put your right hand on the kettlebell, and you rip it from your left foot over your right shoulder. Now that's why weight is very important. You don't want that much weight, because actually you want that rip speed. And what you're trying to achieve is a fast, momentous movement to start off with. Then, as the kettlebell travels over your shoulder, you're having to brace around the core as you twist to stop the kettlebell flying off. Now that causes that work on that twisting around the body, which we often lose, but also the ability to twist and brace the core. So that's an absolutely fantastic exercise to do. The other things like kettlebell swings are also very good for getting back movement and mobility. So having a kettlebell that's an appropriate weight that you can throw around at home or outside is absolutely fantastic, particularly as it's getting sunny now. One of the things I do is I have my kettlebell outside, and as soon as it gets sunny in the morning, I head out and do a few of the exercises throwing that kettlebell around. So these are the kind of strength training things you can do at home. At the gym, you could start by doing some deadlifting is always a really good thing. I don't like heavyweight squatting personally, because I think that it can cause a lot of imbalances, but learning how to deadlift properly and gradually improving that deadlift, essentially not straight-legged. I like to do just a standard remaining deadlift. In fact, if I actually do it with a cage, what's called a hex bar deadlift, because it takes the load off the back, enables you to lift higher weights, and actually is well proven to increase running form and efficiency by really working or enabling you to lift a higher weight that essentially works on all those tissues. So that's the basics of what I would do in terms of strength training. It doesn't need to be overthought. It needs to be predominantly full body and trying to get all those twisting movements, but just trying to add a little bit of weight to a lot of the daily movements that you do. So don't try and overthink things. Try and incorporate some of those things as best you can. Always seek some help if you're not sure about technique and those side of things. Get someone to see you and see whether you're doing things the right way, because strength training, more than anything else, can precipitate certain injuries if it's not done properly. Thank you very much. If you've got any more questions around this, just send them over and I'll keep trying to answer them. Have a good next few days.